I'm going to teach you how to write a book in a day, which means that you could create dozens of books in weeks. Nonfiction authors have been using these techniques for basically decades now, and they are quite effective in the nonfiction space, but it's one of those things that the fiction authors haven't really picked up yet. So I'm going to be talking specifically about fiction, but keep in mind that any of these things could easily be applied to nonfiction as well. And of course, since this channel is all about using AI, I will tell you about how you can use AI to get started on this, but we are talking a little bit more high level here. So if you like this video, be sure to let me know in the comments and I'll create more detailed videos talking specifically about how we can create books in a day for specific genres, and I can show you examples of the prompts that I would use for each individual genre. And with that in mind, let's dive in. So you're probably thinking, well, a book in a day, there's got to be a catch, right? And there is to a certain extent. When I say book in a day, I'm not talking about a huge 50,000 plus word novel, all right? Even using AI, it can be a lengthy process to actually create a whole novel. If you go and look on my channel, I've got a series of live streams that I did back in November where I wrote an entire novel on the live streams, and it took me about 30 days to write a 50,000 word novel, which is about what any normal person can also do if you're writing 2,000 words a day or so. The kind of book I'm talking about today is a smaller book that is a lot easier to create with AI. Before, this might have taken several days to create instead of one day, but it is a smaller supplemental book. There are some ways to beef these books up that are pretty easy, and I'll get into those in a second. These are what I call sawdust books. These are quick reads that you get from the byproducts of your other books, and they can be really helpful to actually make money with your books and to make it seem like you have a lot more titles than you actually do, which can be a really useful thing to do when you are just starting out as an author and don't have that many books written yet. So let me give you some examples of what these quick read books might look like. I actually created one right here. This was kind of a prototype for something I was thinking of doing, and in the future when I have a little bit more time, I'm going to be making a whole bunch of these because they tie into my world and my fantasy world a little bit. Since I write fantasy, this is what I call a lore book. And I think a lore book is really good if you write science fiction or fantasy. It just contains information about the world that we're in. It has kind of a short story at the beginning, but told in a more like oral storytelling type of fashion, which was really quick to get down. And then following that, I have several articles that I actually wrote for my website that I just packaged in together with these. All of those together took me easily less than 8 hours to create, including all of the articles, all of the short story at the beginning, and everything, all of the explanation of the lore and everything that goes into this. And so this was my prototype, and that works for fantasy and science fiction. But let me just briefly go over what this might look like for you. There are a whole bunch of options that don't necessarily line up with fantasy or science fiction. In general, I'd say most of these books should be pieced together of several different things that would be interesting to readers. The obvious one would be things like a short story. Right? Short stories go really well in this kind of environment. And in fact, I would say that should be your default. Include a short story in one of these. And then if you want to pad it out a little bit more, you can add a few other things as well. But short stories, especially with AI, don't take too long to write. And I even have a video about how to write a short story, which you can check out as well. Other things that you could do pretty much regardless of genre are character profiles, character interviews, like interviews that you have done with characters, and maybe even character journal entries. These are all things that you could write with AI, but they are also, many of them might be byproducts of things you've already written in preparation for writing your book. You may have already actually fleshed out the characters and created profiles for them. Those are things that are actually interesting to some readers, and so putting them as supplemental material in these books can actually be a really good idea. For fantasy, I've already kind of mentioned, but having lore entries, you could also have information about maps, about your species, about locations, items. I like things that are sort of in universe, so maybe some explorer's notes or journal entries or something like that could be fun. For science fiction, you could also do things like schematics on various technologies or information about the technology and how it works. You could continue on with the lore book idea, so having information about different worlds, aliens, that sort of thing. But what about something like mysteries or thrillers? One of the things that I like to do, in addition to your regular short stories and character profiles and things, would be to create something like a crime scene report. Readers love that sort of thing. In-universe documents So crime scene reports, police autopsy reports, newspaper clippings, dossiers on your suspects or victims, notes from a private investigator, that sort of thing could be really cool. For romance, you could do something like dating profile of your characters, or perhaps even love notes between different characters, or text messages that they text each other with. Supplemental materials like that you wouldn't necessarily put in the book, but could be nice just bonus info that readers might like. You could even take a single date and have a brief sort of choose your own adventure story of that date, where the reader gets to choose like what the character does in the date. And it could be a simple choose your own adventure, which are actually really easy to do these days thanks to AI. For historical fiction, you could have things like similar to the lore books, but about actual history, things that happen. So in this lore book, I actually put together several articles about the mythology that this is based on, because it's based on mythology, as you can tell by the title, Dawn of Ra. I put information about the actual mythological story behind the story that I'm putting together. You could easily do something like that for fiction as well. Just talk about the era. And this is actually a good thing that you could do beforehand, before you actually write your book, because it will actually give you experience and opportunity to research the era that you're in. And then you have a byproduct, something you can sell. You could also do things like fun newspaper clippings from the period that you're talking about, or maybe recipes from the era. Lots of cool things you could do with historical fiction. Then for horror, there are very similar things to the lore books as well. You could have information about the cursed items or the monsters or criminal profiles in a slasher type horror novel. Anything like that is totally doable. Additionally, if you want to beef these out even more, for some genres it might be appropriate to look into the public domain. For instance, I just wrote my book Heirs of Dracula, and that book is basically a sequel to the novel Dracula. And so if I wanted, I could create a lore book that has information about some of the things that I talk about in Heirs of Dracula, but I could also just tag on the original Dracula to that lore book, and then it would be a much beefier book. Things like that, totally doable. It's not something that works for every single genre, but you would be surprised at what you could do. For instance, there are a lot of pulp novels and pulp short stories out there that are in the public domain, and a lot of those pulp stories were the predecessors of our modern genres. They have pulp stories for romance and lots of good pulp stories. Probably the best is for detective, mystery, thriller type things. There isn't a lot of what we now consider fantasy, but a lot of the predecessors of modern horror and sort of darker fantasy have their origins in pulp, and science fiction also has a lot of good origins in pulp. A lot of those came a little later and aren't quite in the public domain yet, so you'll have to do your research. But if you wanted, you could take inspiration from one of those short stories. You could include it as a bonus, like here's a short story that I really like that sort of captured the vibe that I'm going for, or something like that, and you can just include the short story that already exists in there and not even have to write a thing. And those can be highly useful and interesting to readers, especially when they've been curated by you, the author. So we've kind of established why you would actually want to write any of these things. As many of you know, I'm a big fan of this guy called Russell Brunson, and one of the things that he talks about, and it's not just him, it's kind of a widely accepted principle in the marketing world, is find ways to enhance your offer. And in the world of AI, things are going to be becoming so saturated that we want to be able to find ways to enhance our offer without just overwhelming ourselves with work, right? And so you could write one book, but then if you released 3 supplemental, books like this to go with it, suddenly that book seems more valuable. You can charge more money for it. So instead of charging, $5 for it, you could charge $10 or $20. And when you add things on to your offer like that, it can actually make a big difference. And there are other ways to enhance your offer besides these books in a day, but this is just one way to do it. And if you're selling only on Amazon or other retailers, all this can do is just make it look like you have more titles. Now, I would be clear, I would make sure that people know that these are short reads and everything, but overall, it can be a really useful thing to have your main book, say, priced at $5, and then a couple of these priced at $1 or $2, and that could be really useful. And you could even increase that. So say your main book is $10, these could be $3, however you want to do it, and you can include them in the same series. And something I plan on doing, for instance, I have an 8-book fantasy series. Something I plan on doing is having a lore book for each one of those, and I would just include them in the same series. So now it looks like I have 16 books in my series. So people naturally just perceive more value in those 16 books. And I would, of course, price these lore books at a much lower price than the main books. But you could see how that would make this just more valuable useful at first glance. So while this video is not going to be a full in-depth tutorial, I do want to talk briefly about what you would actually do. What are the step-by-step process of creating a book like this one? And the first thing would be to go to AI and actually brainstorm a few options. Tell them your genre. You can enter in a few of the ideas that I've given you so far, but then ask ChatGPT or Claude or whichever model you're using for some ideas of different supplemental materials that you could write or flesh out. Perhaps you have some materials already that AI could enhance. So say you've written a paragraph or two about every single one of your characters. You can give those paragraphs to the AI, allow it to expand those things, whatever it is, but just use the AI to brainstorm and get a few ideas to start. You can even use some of the larger models like Claude to analyze your book as a whole and then create specific lore entries for certain things. So if, for example, I wanted to create some more lore items for this, I could give it my entire book and say, write me a Wikipedia entry for this artifact that exists in this book, or about this character or this species. That's actually one of the quickest ways to get some of information, is to give it your book already or any previous information that you've developed about the characters or anything like that, and to ask it to give you like a full Wikipedia entry. Then you write it, and you can do this with the AI's help, although I do recommend some heavy edits to make sure everything is accurate to your world and to your characters. And then you write a few more lore entries, more dating profiles, more criminal profiles, whatever it is you're creating. Write a few more, write some information about the characters, maybe write a whole short story. And once again, I have a video I'll link to below about how to write a short story with AI. And then you package all of these little pieces together into what I would say is appropriate, about 5,000 to 10,000 words for a single book like this. Obviously, that could be a lot larger if you're packaging some public domain stuff in there with it, but unless you're adding public domain, I would say 5,000 to 10,000 words is normal. Then there's the step of developing a book cover, and actually AI and its help in creating book covers is one of the reasons this is possible, because creating books, small books like this, and then paying $200, $300, $500 for a quality book cover was just not economically feasible, right? So if I made 10 of these and I paid $200 each at a conservative level for a quality book cover, that's $2,000, right? And that's not really something I can afford, especially if I'm pumping these out left and right. And so I have a video all about how to create book covers with AI, to create book covers like this one. This one was created with AI, everything except the text. And that can be really useful for this type of book. And so I'll have that linked right here. The last step, of course, is to just publish the book. I'll see you in the next video.